do today is we are going to finish chapter 10, and then we are going to chapter 6, and we're going to start chapter 10. What is remaining, the remainder part of chapter 6 is basically about the price elasticity of supply. So what we have covered so far in chapter 6 was we have looked at 3 measurements of elasticity. All are tied to the consumer or the demand side. We looked at the price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, and cross price elasticity of demand. Each of these were designed to give you an idea about how the buyer responds to changes in the market. How the price or the income or the cross price causes our buyer to change their purchasing decision. Those were very important and very useful, but now what we're going to do, we're going to switch to the other side of the market. We are now going to focus on our producer. Just like our consumer, our producer also faces the same market price. And we want to now understand how does our producers respond to those price changes. Now, we are going to formally start looking at this price elasticity of supply, and I am going to sort of open up a Word document, which I also hope that you guys will be writing along with me, so that this becomes part of a single document where all the elasticity concepts are discussed. So what we are going to do today is we are going to discuss price elasticity of supply. So price elasticity of supply basically is measured as that. So in the price elasticity of demand, we had epsilon S, now we have epsilon D. And that is measured as follows. You measured the percentage change in quantity supplied on the numerator, and you measured percentage change in price. So what you're asking in this calculation is that whenever there is a percentage change in price, how much quantity supplied changes by the producer? You take the percentage change in price in the denominator, you take the percentage change in quantity supplied in the numerator, and the resulting calculation is called price elasticity of supply. Notice that similar to price elasticity of demand, the sign of this number is irrelevant. Why? What is the sign of this price elasticity of demand of supply? Very good. In case of a price elasticity of demand, the signs were always negative, because whenever price changes, quantity demanded always changes in the opposite direction of the price. So that's why we said that the sign of the price elasticity of demand was irrelevant. In this case, the sign of the price elasticity of supply is always positive. Why? Because of the law of supply. We know, according to law of supply, is that if there is an increase in price, meaning that price change is positive, quantity supplied is going to go up. So that will indicate that the sign is always a positive sign. Or if there is a decline in the price, the quantity supplied will also go down. So it means that either you have 2 negative numbers or 2 positive numbers in the denominator and the numerator. So the resulting price elasticity of supply is always a positive number. So the sign again is irrelevant. So if the sign of the price elasticity of supply is irrelevant, what is important is the magnitude. We can think about several different kind of magnitude of the price elasticity of supply. One, so what we're going to do, we're going to look at the absolute value of the price elasticity of supply. If this is greater than 1, we call this elastic. If this is less than 1, we call it inelastic. But you have to understand that whether a supply curve is elastic or inelastic is a relative concept. It is always in relation to another supply curve that we can claim that a certain supply curve is price inelastic or elastic. Example, imagine that you have 2 supply curves. One looks like that and the other looks like that. So if you have two supply curve S1 and S2, you can say that S1 is inelastic compared to S2 and S2 is more elastic compared to S1, right? So it's a relative measurement. S1 is more inelastic compared to S2 and S2 is more elastic compared to S1. Okay, so you can always have elasticity equal to 1. We call it unit elastic. That's not that important. It's not empirically even possible to have that. But then we have two other measurement of price elasticity of supply which are extreme values but are sometimes discussed. One is when the price elasticity of supply is infinite. What infinite price elasticity of supply means is that for a given change in price, the quantity supplied is very, very large. And that can be represented by a vertical supply curve. Sorry, horizontal supply curve. So when price elasticity of supply is infinite, our supply curve is horizontal. The last measurement of price elasticity of supply is when it is 0. When it is 0, it means that for a given change in price, quantity supplied really does not change. What does it mean? It means that when price elasticity of supply is 0, our supply curve is a vertical line. Please pay attention to this vertical supply curve. This vertical supply curve says that if the supply curve is vertical, regardless of what the market price is, your quantity is always Q1. You will see that. So it means that your supply really does not respond to any changes in price. We have just talked about various responsiveness of our price to changes in, various responsiveness of our supply to changes in price. Okay, it could be the supply curve could be vertical, the supply curve could be horizontal, or the supply curve could be anywhere between a vertical or a horizontal supply curve. Depending on the shape of the supply curve, we can therefore learn a lot about how responsiveness are our supply to changes in price. But what we will do now is go a little bit deep on this idea. So what your chapter really does not do a good job is that it really does not explain the set of factors that affect the price elasticity of supply. For the demand side, it allocated a lot of time and a lot of space in explaining the factors that affect price elasticity of demand, like the availability of substitutes, like the size of the market, like time. These were factors that were affecting your price elasticity of demand. Do we have similar set of factors that affect our price elasticity of supply? So what I am covering right now is based on the material that I will upload in Blackboard in the form of a video lecture and with a complementary Word document. We can argue that there are factors that can affect the supply price elasticity of supply curve as well. So our discussion today on that topic will start on trying to understand the relationship between supply and production. Right? So let's try to understand the supply side from the producer side. So our supply curve is trying to give us an idea about what amount of good our producers are willing to supply at a given price. Now how much our producers will be willing to supply at a given price really depends on how much they are able to produce at that price. So production and supply decisions are intrinsically connected. So in order to understand how our producers respond to price changes, we really need to understand how their production respond to price changes. Are we all clear on this? So, and this is probably the most concrete way of trying to understand the supply curve. Supply curve is connected with the production decisions of our firm. Okay, so factors that affect your price elasticity of supply are quite few. Let's first start with the idea that cost is important for a firm. So cost is important for a firm to make their production decisions. We want to now understand how costs affect the supply decisions of a firm and therefore affect the price elasticity of supply of a firm. For the time being, let's just assume that the cost of the production is fixed. What does that mean? It means that for any given amount of output our firm produces, our firm incurs the same cost. Highly unrealistic, by the way, but stay with me. If cost of production is fixed, meaning that it really doesn't matter whether you produce 1 unit or 50 units, you are going to pay the same cost of production. If that is the case, how would our producers respond to price changes? Are they going to respond to price changes more aggressively or less aggressively? Let me repeat my question again. Let's imagine that the cost of production is fixed. For producing more, our firm does not incur any more cost. And in this situation, price goes up. Do our producers respond aggressively by producing more and supplying more, or do they respond slowly to that price change? I want some answer. Why? Are we all clear on that? Whenever cost of production does not change, which is highly unlikely, but if the cost of production changes slowly, increase in price means that firms can literally make a lot of profit by producing more, supplying more, earning more revenue, right? The more the firm produces, the more revenue a firm can get by selling more, and the more revenue a firm gets with a given cost, the profit is going to go up, right? Profit is the difference between cost and total revenue. With a given cost being constant, cost doesn't change, total revenue goes up. That means your profit goes up. So it is obviously true that if for somehow the cost is constant, a change in price causes our suppliers to be more aggressive towards that change in price, meaning that supply will be
higher.
Supply will be higher. So here the discussion is not about higher supply. We're trying to understand that numerator in our price elasticity of supply, right? For a given change in price, our price elasticity of supply, our quantity supplied is going to be very, very large. The change is going to be very large. That's what we mean by aggressiveness. So as a result, our price elasticity of supply for a good for which the cost of production is constant will have a higher price elasticity, right? So in this price elasticity of supply measurement, if our cost of production is constant, for a given price change in the denominator, our quantity supplied changes are going to be much larger, which means that our price elasticity of supply is going to be a very large number. It's going to be probably greater than 1, which means that our supply curve is going to be elastic. Make sense? So let's just fill in the blanks. For a fixed cost, our supply curve is going to be more elastic. Any question? Does it make sense? Anyone? Okay, so the next, so what other factors do you think could affect your price elasticity of supply? The next one that I want to talk about is fixed production. Where, let's imagine that you have a specific production process where you can produce only certain quantity at a given period of time. Please try to understand this example closely, because we are going to talk about two fundamentally different kind of examples, but both of them share the same property. imagine the production of paintings. Paintings, right? So artist needs to allocate a lot of time in painting one picture, right? Regardless of how much you are willing to pay for that, an artist can only paint one picture at a given period of time. So there is a fixed quantity in production happening here. Are we all clear on that? In case of Mona Lisa, there is just one of them, right? Regardless of what the price of that good is, there is no other production, right? What kind of supply curve do you think we are going to be seeing when there is a fixed quantity of production? How does the supply curve for Mona Lisa look like? It's a vertical line, right? It's a vertical line fixed at 1. Isn't that right? What kind of elasticity does that supply curve has? It is 0. It's a perfectly inelastic supply curve, right? The next example is kind of strange, but please stay with me. The next example that we're going to talk about before making the conclusion is oil production. Oil production is a very time-consuming, very expensive endeavor. Oil extraction from earth is very risky. People who are involved in oil extraction has a very high health insurance premium because a lot of them die. Okay, so if you are in the oil production and supply business, you can only produce certain quantity of oil at a given period of time. So as a result, your supply really does not respond to prices that much. Do you understand that? Because regardless of what the price is, you can only produce certain quantity of or certain quantity of oil at a given period of time. Make sense? Makes sense. The third example is fishing. Similar to oil production, try to understand that fishing also can be done at a given period of time. Fishermen who catch fish from the sea can only catch fish at a given period of time of a year. For crab, it's like 3 months. For the remainder of the year, regardless of what the price of that good is, our sellers really cannot sell anything. They cannot produce anything, they cannot sell anything. So if we combine these 3 ideas, 3 examples, for all these, your supply is going to be very inelastic. In the first case, in the painting case, is going to be perfectly inelastic. In the oil production or in the fishing case, it is going to be quite price inelastic. Make sense? Any question? The next one is time. Again, I want to understand what time is. If you pay attention to the discussion of time, we have talked about time many times. Time is very important. On the demand side, time was critical. We argued that over time, from the perspective of a consumer, over time, there can be more substitutes available to your production of the goods that you buy. Over time, the market could increase. There could be a lot of cheap substitutes for the goods that you want to buy. So over time, demand becomes more price elastic. Do you remember that? This will be in your exam, by the way. So please, when you are reviewing this, pay attention to the various things that we have covered in the class. One last point about the exam. You will definitely start preparing for the exam starting from this week. Please remember that the exam will cover everything that we have covered in the chapters. So there is a sort of uniform distribution in terms of how I ask questions from different part of the chapter. So in order to really do well, you have to cover every concept that we have covered in the class. I never ask questions that are from concepts that I didn't cover in the class. So please make a sort of mapping between what we have covered and how you should prepare for the exam. So on the demand side, time was very important. Does time affect the supply side? And if it does, how? what can time give to our producers?
More of an opportunity to produce things.
Very good. So that could be one, or that could be a direct way of getting away from this very inelastic supply, right? If you're an oil producer, over time you can produce more, right? How can you produce more over time? I mean, I don't understand that. At the beginning it kind of makes sense, but when I'm trying to think about time, what does it mean when I say that over time our producers can produce more? That's obviously true, right? If you produce 10 gallons of oil in one day, you probably produce 10 times 360 gallons of oil in a given year, right? So in that way, it's a no-brainer. But is this how time affects our supply decisions or production decisions? We need to go a little bit deep on this. What else can time give us?
Do you have like a perishable item, like you have
So we're going to come back to that. Very good. Hold that thought for 1 minute. Very good. Very impressive answer. What else? What is the most important driving force on the supply side that we have covered in chapter 4? What is the primary determinant of supply in the market? Or to put it in the simple words, out of all the factors that we have talked about that affect the supply side, which one was the most important one? Technology. Okay, so with time, there are more innovations. With time, people will find better ways of producing things. With time, people will find technology that can make the production process cheaper. So how will your supply elasticity change with time? So with time, with the availability of new technology, how should your supply curve look like? Anyone? So let's say this is your supply curve of a week. What should you expect to happen to this supply curve over a long period of time? Very good. Over time, you should expect this supply curve to sort of pivot and become flatter. Right? Because with time, notice for the given price change, you will be able to produce more, right? Are we all clear on this? So with time, our supply curve becomes elastic. Make sense? With time, our supply curve becomes more elastic. Just like for the demand side, with time, our demand curve became more elastic. But for fundamentally different reasons, right? With time, we were getting more substitutes. That is kind of connected with technology, by the way. But more on that later. Now, let's come back to the point that he mentioned. When we think about production, we have to think about whether the production is storable or not, whether the production is durable or not, because it makes a huge difference. If you produce something which is non-durable, meaning that it gets spoiled very quickly, how do you make your production decision as opposed to that, let's say your goods are storable. If your goods are storable, you can really produce all of them in a bunch, in a quantity, put them in inventory. Whenever price changes, you respond to that aggressively by either selling less or selling more. Do you all understand that? When you can store something, you can be very responsive to prices. When you cannot store your good, you have to be very careful about how much you produce and how much you supply. Because if you somehow overproduce, part of the good is going to get spoiled and you are going to lose money. So, if your good is storable, you are going to be very price sensitive. So, for a storable good, for a given change in price, your quantity supplied is going to be much larger, so the slope is going to be a larger, so the elasticity is going to be a larger number. So with if the good is storable, your supply curve is elastic again. Make sense? Okay, that concludes our main discussion about price elasticity or elasticity in general, both on the demand side and on the supply side. What I'm going to do now, I will try to allocate 5 more minutes to have a comprehensive discussion about how these two concepts are directly connected with each other. What we are going to do now is do very similar experiments that we did in chapter 4, where we showed that the shape of the demand curve and supply curve are intrinsically connected. Given certain change in demand, the change in price really depends on the supply side and vice versa. So the shape of the demand curve and the supply curve are directly connected with each other. In order to better understand that, let us consider 2 different cases. Let us consider a case where demand is increasing. And I'm going to draw 2 different cases, case 1 and case 2. In my case 1, I am going to work with a demand curve that is, so that is demand is, I'm going to work with a supply curve that is very inelastic, and I'm going to consider increase in demand, let's say from D to D1 to D2, price increases from P1 to P2, and in my case 2, I am going to work with a much flatter demand supply curve, but I am going to consider the similar kind of, so if I have the same demand curve and I want to consider the same increase in demand from D1 to D2 with the same supply curve, my price goes up from P3 to P4. Okay, so 2 different cases, the same increase in demand from D to D1, the different kind of changes in price, P1 to P2, from P3 to P2, P3 to P4. Now, where do you think price have gone up more? In order to avoid confusion, let's remember that P1 and P3 are the same, so that we don't get confused. Are we all clear on that? In one case, price went from P1 to P2. In other case, price went up from P1 to P4. Why do you think price went up more? Yes?
Case seems more elastic.
Supply curve is more elastic. So with a more elastic supply curve, do you think the price change is going to be larger or smaller? Yes. Why? So notice the case 1 is a supply curve which is very, very inelastic, meaning that with a given price, the quantity demanded changes are much smaller, right? So here, if the demand goes up from D1 to D2 in case 1, our producers are going to shift the burden of this price change on the consumer. The producer is going to say that, hey, we are not that price sensitive. So the only way you can get more from me is by paying me a higher price. That's exactly what the seller is telling to the buyer. That I am not price sensitive. I am not going to jump to supplying more whenever you raise the price. The only way you can get more from me, from this to that, from Q1 to Q2, is if you substantially raise the price. So price will rise more in case 1. Okay? Make sense? The next one is a situation where supply is now changing. somehow these things like really infuriate me. Either I don't know how to do them, work on them, probably that's the case. Man, let's open something new. Oh, come on. Okay, so the next case is when supply is increasing. Okay, so you have case 1 and case 2. In case 1 and case 2, we are going to think about the same kind of setup. In the first one, I'm going to imagine a sort of a steeper demand curve. I'm going to assume that the original market price is the same. Let's say that this one is the original supply curve. This is demand. Now supply is increasing, let's say from S to S1. And in the second case, I'm going to assume a little bit of flatter demand curve, and this is my supply curve. So both of these same demand and same supply. This one is a steeper demand curve, this one is a flatter demand curve. In the case 1 with a steeper demand curve, my price goes down from P1 to P2. In the second case, for the same vertical rightward shift of the supply curve, from S to S1, my price goes down from P1 to P3. Okay? So I want to understand where is price going down more. In this case, price goes down from P1 to P2. In case 2, price goes down from P1 to P3. In case 1, demand is inelastic. In case 2, demand is elastic. Where do you see prices going down more? Price goes down more again with case 1 where demand is inelastic. So you should, if you compare these 4 pictures, you would realize that if demand is inelastic or supply is inelastic, the change in price is always larger. Either price was going up more in case of an inelastic supply curve, or price went down more in case of an inelastic demand curve. This is very much consistent with what we covered in chapter 4, where we showed that the different kind of movement in equilibrium price and quantity happens as a result of the shape of the demand curve and the supply curve. But now we are making a more forceful statement by saying that the elasticity of demand and supply directly affects equilibrium movement in price and quantity, according to this and according to what we have just covered. Any question? I'm going to quickly, delete all these and move to chapter 10. I want to at least, start chapter 10. Chapter 10, this is the first time I am covering chapter 10 in a Principles of Microeconomics course in this university. For a long time, I have not covered this chapter. By not covering this chapter, I realized over time that I have done a great disservice to my students. Because many of you are going to be taking intermediate microeconomics or intermediate macroeconomics or some advanced economics course such as public finance, public economics, international economics. And when you do that, you are going to encounter this particular chapter or the materials that are included in chapter 10. What is included in chapter 10 is a very detailed discussion about the behavioral side of the market. And this is again a challenging chapter in the sense that chapter 4 and chapter 5 were challenging because there was a lot of calculations involved. Chapter 10 is difficult because the concepts are difficult to understand. But please stay with me, we should be okay to finish this chapter. Okay? What we want to do in chapter 10 is to talk more seriously about how our consumers make decisions in their marketplace. We have in chapter 4 talked about this idea of taste, a taste that really governs how our buyer is going to buy from the market, how they are going to make their purchasing decisions. But that's not sufficient. The factors that affect our consumer to make a purchasing decision or a buying decision is fairly complicated and important. Now, we can argue that a major part of the activities that our buyer is performing in the market is really based on his or her characteristics. What kind of person they are, what kind of things they like, what is happening inside their head. And in the modern iteration of the economics courses that you take or will be taking, you really don't see that picture. The picture that sort of pins down economics as part of the traditional social science discipline, like psychology, like sociology, like anthropology, where we want to understand human behavior. Human behavior is at the heart of our market, because without understanding human behavior, we really cannot know why a consumer buys something, right? We want to fill the gap a little bit in this chapter by trying to understand the behavior of an individual in the market. So we want to be very careful from the onset that we are not interested in studying human behavior. We don't really care about what you do inside your house or inside your bedroom. We care about what you do in a marketplace. When you go to a market, you have some money, what are the things you are buying? So we are interested in consumer behavior. And this chapter is going to talk about only the human behavior that is associated with a consumer. Our discussion will start with a very important assumption that we made at the beginning of this course. And the assumption was that we assume that our consumers or our buyers are rational. We argued that this is a fundamental assumption. It's a fundamental assumption because if you do not assume your consumers being rational, you really cannot explain why somebody wants to buy a smartphone while the other person with the same income level probably wants to buy a bike or something. What distinguishes us from one another is fairly important in terms of how we react or act in the marketplace. And if we start from somewhere else, it becomes a very difficult topic to analyze in the context of economics. So we are going to start with the assumption that our consumers are rational, meaning that they will never buy something that is beyond their budget, beyond their means, and they will always try to utilize all their income. So our consumers will try to buy things that will make them happy. That's actually what rationality means in a nutshell. Happiness, a new word that I just have introduced, is central to our discussion in the next class. We're going to say that happiness is what motivates or drives a buyer to go to a market and buy something. Happiness is connected with another word called satisfaction. Satisfaction is what we get when we buy something. Satisfaction is more measurable, happiness not. Because how do you know whether you're happy or not? But satisfaction, probably you can get an idea about whether a person is satisfied or not satisfied. In the next class, we're going to add a third word. They are all synonymous. We're going to add a word called utility. We're going to say utility is the way we economists talk about satisfaction. Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend. Please try to submit the quiz and the homework.